21 days. When he was finally released on bail, hearing that he was likely to be detained again, he fled to neighboring Botswana. He joined the African National Congress, was trained in Angola, and later worked for the ANC in Zambia. When he returned to his homeland, he became engaged in cultural policy. He was director of television programming at South African Broadcasting, and even collaborated on an opera with another former exile, Hugh Masekela. I spoke to Mandalanga in Johannesburg in 2000. You once described one of your earliest childhood memories as it was a riot in Natal Township, days and nights of fire and battles with soldiers in the streets, and particularly the women who were armed with sticks and dustbin lids, rousing the community to unite and struggle. Were there many such scenes in your early years?
In the early 60s, there were political troubles in this country, and I grew up among people who were very active in politics. So a whole lot of times it happened that when there were those riots in a place called Chesterville, it was the women, I remember, who would move from door to door, getting people into, galvanizing them into action. So it really happened, yeah. It was not an unusual circumstance at that time.
What kind of impression did that make on you?
At first, it was scary because it also showed something that has been with me for a very long time, and that is the people that we might have held up as community leaders. I remember there was this principal, for instance, whom we all respected. So one day, one evening, there was this burning and screaming and running battles on the streets. In the morning, we found a mattress on the street, and it was a mattress from him. He had been trying to escape from the fighting in the township and had lashed the mattress on the top of his car, running away. So that finished him in the eyes of the community. So it was a time also, I would say, of revelations, of betrayal from sectors that you might have thought were your pillars.
When you say you grew up in an environment of protest, of political action, you mean in the community or within your family? Or?
Both, yeah, the community and the family. And it was also in the family itself that you found political consciousness in a mother, for instance, which is a center that's not traditionally reputed to be very political. In fact, mothers are supposed to be the ones who tell you not to get too involved in things. But it happened in our family.
Your mother was politically engaged?
She was politically engaged, yeah. She never took up cudgels. She never rallied people around. But the very fact that she did encourage us or did not restrain us from getting involved in political activity gave us a moral support, really, a moral backing to continue with what could, in other circumstances, be seen as incredibly useless.
I'd like to talk a little about your background because your observations as a child, these events in your own life reflect what was going on in the country during that period of history. You were born in 1950 in Stanger on the northern Natal coast, but your family moved around a lot. Why was that?
Well, my father was a preacher, was a minister of religion. And in fact, he had been born somewhere in the north of this country, what could easily have been the northern province, or could have been Zimbabwe, or could have been Mozambique. He was always on the move. Most of us were born in different terrains. I got born in Stanger. We had a church there. We lived in a church house. Then we moved from there to Mayville, which was a place that was very, very racially mixed. And then the teeth of the Group Areas Act started to bite. We moved to Chesterville and then to Wamashu, which was my last township really before I left the country in 1976.
Now, Mayville was, as you're saying, a racially mixed town, but then Chesterville It was a removal, in fact. You were removed to a black township.
We were moved to a black township, yes, and it was Chesterfield.
What was that like? How was that different from where you had been earlier?
Well, I mean, you grow up having an idealized view of the world. You are living with people, you share things, and they might be white, they might be colored, so-called, they might be Indian, they might be African, but you have a common process in which you all partake. You go to school, you fight, and then you play. But then when you get to be moved to a place like Chesterfield, apart from the fact that Mayville architecturally, the houses were quite different. I mean, people built their own houses. In Chesterfield, this was regulation barracks type houses that were built for people by the municipality, by the regime of the hour. So by and large, you started to deal with a very, very different set of circumstances. You dealt with houses that are rows and rows of sameness. You deal with roads that at night become incredibly dangerous.
Because
people are corralled in this place. They inevitably prey on each other. You find where you might have walked to school in 5 or 10 minutes, you have to walk to school, taking over an hour just to get to your type of school. So these are some of the things that perhaps people take for granted, but which, when you then get thrust into them, you find yourself dealing with a very, very different reality altogether.
in the mid-60s, as you were saying, your family was again forced to move, and this time to Kwamashu Township, which is near Durban. Kwamashu is the setting for a lot of your stories, and it is clearly a place that has a strong imaginative hold on you. Why is that?
Well, if Chesterfield was grim, Kwamashu was a place that taught us how to survive. It's a place that was totally without any pretensions to comfort. So you just had to come to terms with it. It was also a place where you found a lot of people who had been moved from different places. So it became a melting pot of African experience. We grew up there, we came of age there. Some of our friends died there. So as young people there, we started, I think, to learn how to survive both the state and how to survive our surroundings.
Mandla Langa, you went to the University of Fort Hare in the early 70s, and that was during the time of student unrest with demonstrations and sit-ins and mass expulsions, and you're involved with the Black Consciousness movement. Can you describe what the scene was like then?
We went to Fort Hare knowing, believing, still holding the memory that it's a place that had spawned leaders such as Nelson Mandela, Oliver Tambo, that most of the African leaders had actually studied at Fort Hare. So there was at the time a great flirtation with anything that was from outside. I think as South Africans, we were looking out for answers to resolve what was going on inside South Africa. And at the time, the most cohesive political philosophy was the philosophy of the Black Consciousness movement. Things were very, very different, very tough at the university itself. You still found that in this so-called liberal institution, there were not just vestiges, but there were all sorts of icons and monuments, to that blasphemed past, that apartheid past that you were trying to deal with. You found that the lecturers and the wardens, even though they were black, were much more ready to instill the kind of precepts that you'd expect from the white administrators. It gave grist to the mill. It made real what someone once said, that the problem with us is that we think that since all our brothers are black, then all blacks are our brothers. It became quite clear that we were also dealing with a very, very, very powerful force of state at Fort Hare. So how do we go about dealing with this? The only thing that we knew was the power of student action, of strikes, sit-ins. But at the same time, at the back of our minds, we were aware that whatever action we take here also pulls us back in relation to, achieving our goals as people have come for training and education. So perhaps at some stage you just have to suspend this to go and fight another day.
Madalanga in Johannesburg in 2000. His most recent novel is The Texture of Shadows. You're listening to a special edition of Writers and Company in the Field on CBC Radio 1 and anytime on the CBC Listen app. I'm Eleanor Wachtel. Australia is the country of dream tracks and songlines in a landscape inhabited for some 60,000 years, the oldest continuing culture in human history. For Aboriginal Australians, the arrival of the First Fleet in 1788, bringing English convicts and soldiers, is known as Shame Day. In 2008, in one of his first official acts as Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd made a long-awaited formal apology to the stolen generations. Indigenous children who were forcibly removed from their families by government agencies for more than 100 years, apologizing to them and their descendants and to the wider community. The following year, I traveled to Australia to meet with writers who reflected the country's diversity and energy, especially the powerful stories and imagination of Aboriginal authors. And I made a beeline for Alexis Wright, who was already a literary sensation. Her 2006 novel, Carpentaria, is strikingly original, drawing on oral tradition and mythology, and at the same time engaging with issues as immediate as the day's news. It won almost every literary award in Australia, and became the country's first work by an Indigenous writer to win the country's most illustrious fiction prize, the Miles Franklin Award. Alexis Wright was born in 1950, a member of the Wayanadi Nation in the Gulf of Carpentaria. She grew up in Cloncurry, Queensland, about 300 kilometers south of the Gulf. I spoke to Alexis Wright in Melbourne, where she's now a distinguished chair at the university. Your grandmother was an important influence. I mean, you spent a lot of time with her from an early age. Can you tell me about her?
My grandmother was I think she just was a wonderful woman. Everybody loved her. She was deeply loved by all her family.